And that leads us smoothly into the next presentation, which is by our next speaker, Bob Leahy, my fellow co-chair of the National Advisory Committee on Optimal Health and Wellbeing. And I have to admit that when I was approached to co-chair the steering committee, I, was firm in my grounding that, quite honestly, if Bob didn't do it with me, I wouldn't agree either. So thank you for agreeing to that, Bob. So Bob is an activist, advocate, and writer on all things HIV. He lives in rural Ontario and was diagnosed with HIV in 1993. He has volunteered in the HIV community ever since. He has served on executive committees for the Ontario HIV Treatment Network, the Canadian AIDS Society, um, and PARN as well. He has served as editor and publisher for PositiveLight.com and won awards for his work on the Canadian online magazine that we mentioned. And this is just a dip in the ocean of what Bob has done to date. So you can always look on Hoover for Bob's full bio. So welcome, Bob, and thank you.
Thanks, Tammy. It's great to be here and speaking to you, Tammy. Tammy and I have a history. We bonded over an angry elephant, believe it or not, who charged us when we were in South Africa together at an international AIDS conference, and that was one of the highlights of my career, being chased by an elephant with Tammy in the front seat. So that's where we started this. I wanted to say, I should first of all acknowledge the land acknowledgement that Pooja gave, and I certainly share in those sentiments. I want to say too, I think what I'm going to talk about is a really good fit with this particular conference. It's clear to me that there's a sort of groundswell of discussion on living well and what wellness means. So this is why, while my presentation may seem about policy and about global issues, it's really about us. So I'll explain that a bit later. But again, it draws on what I'm talking about, draws on the work that Pooja described, the work of that committee. It draws on the work I did on the U equals U campaign. Again, I'll touch base on that later. And also what's happened in this conference, what Maluba started day one with, talking about what does wellness mean to me, Maluba. What Jason was saying about research, what kind of research we need to do into wellness, and also on day one, what Don and Donnie and Jack were talking about, and the Indigenous view of health and wellness. Anyway, let's look at the first slide. Could we, please? Thank you. Okay, so I think most of us know what 1990 means. So why are we thinking about 1990 right now? Hopefully that will become clear. This is a recap of what 1990, the three 90s, looks like. I think most of us are familiar with those little three round circles there. And just to recap, this is a global initiative developed by UNAIDS, which most countries bought into, and Canada is one of them. You'll see there we have the as of 2018, Canada was at 87, 85, 94, so it didn't quite make it. But now we're at the expiry date. This in 1990 was set to expire at December 2020. So this is in some ways past history. So we're looking at where do we go in the future. So next slide, please. So now we get into the meat of why we're talking about fourth 90. What's missing from the three 90s that we looked at before? And it raises the issue that's been raised several times by different people. Is viral suppression the prime indicator of health and wellness? Certainly it's the 1990 and viral suppression is what Canada has been aiming for, what funders have been aiming for. In Ontario, the AIDS Bureau was very focused on just funding projects which related specifically to the treatment cascade, which is essentially what we're talking about here. So it was very difficult actually to get funding on projects which related to health and wellness. I remember I was engaged in a smoking cessation program with Sean Rourke, and it was very hard to get funding from the AIDS Bureau because it didn't fit into 1990. So I sense all that's changing, but just if you look at the bottom, just one point, what would Fourth 90 look like if we went this route? So you've got sort of two alternatives. One, you've got 90, 90, 90, 90, or look on the right-hand side, you've got a different expression of that. And the reason that different expression has arisen is actually through people living with HIV, like you and me, who thought that having that the fourth 90 expressed in the first way implied that 90% of those virally suppressed would be our target. They would have a quality of life that we could somehow quantify. So, but that's not the case, because if we go with a fourth 90, it would certainly apply to all stages of the treatment cascade, right? So that's and the difference, as I say, the difference is key, and that difference in how we express it was a function of people living with HIV saying that no, if we're going to have quality of life, it has to be applied to all people living with HIV and not just those virally suppressed. So, as I said, next slide, please. So there's a little bit of a wrinkle, because 90-90-90, if we're going to focus on that as a measure of global quality of life or national quality of life, there's, as Pooja mentioned, it expired in December 20, and now there's a new proposal on the table from UNAIDS, and this is the proposal, and this is a busy slide, so it may take you a while to wrap your mind around it, but you'll notice it's mostly based on 95s as opposed to 90s. That the three of those very much replicate the kind of measuring viral suppression, etc., that we're used to, but there's some other stuff in there too. Notice at the center, people living with HIV and communities at risk are at the center of this this approach, and that's important to me. And I think it's starting to show in the kind of discussions that I have been having around this set of targets. But you'll look, there's more than just the 95s. If you look, there's things like on the left-hand side, if it's legible, I hope it is. There's new targets for stigma. That, for instance, only 10% of people living with HIV will experience stigma. Optimistic, but it's good to see it in there for sure. And 10% of countries have no criminalization laws applying to HIV. Again, really good to see that in there. Does all this reflect a quality of life indicator that we would like to see in there? Probably not. I think there's room for discussion around that. But so far, this is a UNAIDS proposal that I don't think has been adopted by any country yet. Next slide, please. So why are we talking about this? Because quality of life specifically isn't really mentioned in the UNAIDS targets. So, and I think we have to recognize that to talk about measuring quality of life, whether it's on our own, about our own life, or globally, or nationally, or regionally, we have to define it, and that's the issue I think many of us have been trying to get to grips with throughout this conference. And there'll be many instances where we've asked ourselves, what will we consider when we talked about quality of life? What will we measure? And you'll see I've put a list here. I mean, the list will not come from me. It will come from the community. It comes from people living with HIV, not bureaucrats, not national, not UNAIDS, not anybody, but people living with HIV. We are the people who have to define what quality of life looks like. And of course, it won't look like the same for everybody. I think we've seen, that was the value, I think, of the day one presentations, where we heard from Donnie and Jack again. And it was clear to me, it's very, very useful to have them here, and very, very helpful for me, because it showed how different the Indigenous view of quality of life is. But anyway, you'll see just things I've suggested. You know, people may come up with successful aging. Clearly, we've talked about that is really important to me. I won't read the list, but you'll look at some of the things it could include. You'll notice sexual, spiritual, and mental health is in there. Oddly, we haven't talked much about sexual health in this context of this conference, but it should be in there, I think. Hopefully people will want to include sexual health, as well as more practical things like mobility, and then happiness, and all those things. All right. Next slide, please. So, how do you get from A to B? How do we get into having a framework for actually measuring quality of life on a national basis, or even on a global basis? So, I put out the steps which I think are the theoretical steps anyway. Consensus that measuring quality of life is important and needs to be measured. I sense we are there already. See what others are doing. Pooja already mentioned that the Europeans are leading a consensus statement on the fourth 90, and we have been talking with the Europeans. It's a global group. Richard Elliott is part of that group, has been our sort of liaison, and so he's kept us up to date with how they are doing. And we've also spoken to the lead organizer in Barcelona, who's leading this. So that's it. We're also scanning what others are doing, and again, it's very important that people living with HIV lead these discussions. We need a consensus around adopting targets. Do we need targets? I think so. What measurement tools are available to be need to be designed, already in place? Big topic. And then, of course, what's the point of this? Is to address inequities and inequalities. If there's no end game, no real reason for doing this, I mean, it's a waste of time. What we're doing is to try and elevate the quality of life for all PHA. So just as headings working. Position paper on Health and Wellbeing, which Pooja just referred to. There's a multi-steering committee in place. Includes CP, co-chaired by Tammy. Literature review is underway, and we consult Europeans who are working on this topic also. I said to be continued, and that's really very much, we're very much in baby steps on this topic, but I sense it's the beginning of a conversation. Last slide, please. We're at the end now. Thank you. I think this is the beginning. I think life and wellness, we're at the start of a conversation that could be just as big as the Equals You conversation. It's defining, I think, what is important to people living with HIV. It's not just You Equals You, although I'm a strong supporter of You Equals You. But there's more to health and wellness than viral suppression, and so that's what we're trying to pin down, to measure, to quantify, and ultimately to celebrate a shift in how we look at HIV. So thank you. That's all I have today.
Great. Thank you so much, Bob, and that's a lot. So thank you. And you know, I'm pretty glad we survived that elephant escapade together, because I'm hoping that we'll be able to go on more adventures one day. So thanks again, Bob.